Hi again, this is Dylan from Teach English Spain, and this is another episode in the Teach English Spain podcast, in which we talk about things related to teach English as a foreign language in Spain, or indeed around the world. So in this episode, I would like to talk a little bit about coursebooks and how we can use coursebooks to encourage learner autonomy. So learner autonomy is when we give students the freedom to take responsibility, to take control, and to decide upon their own needs, and take some responsibility for their own learning development. Now, whatever you might think about using coursebooks in class, most teachers, in most teaching contexts, are either obliged or strongly encouraged to use them. In fact, I can imagine most of you have succumbed to the temptation of starting a lesson by saying something like, "Good morning class, turn to page 42 and do exercise 1. Now, your learners may well be quite comfortable and familiar with this approach, but after a while, most of them will start to wonder why they're paying for classes when they could be doing most of these exercises at home. And this is probably more so in private language academies, and obviously more so with adults who will start to think, hang on one moment, why am I doing this here? I could do this in my own time. What am I really getting from this class? Now, I would suggest that simply following exercises from a course book generally results in ineffective teaching. And does learning occur? Well, possibly, but as I said, it's the type of learning that could be done anywhere. Now, course books, no matter how good they are, and there are some fantastic course books out there, they've been written for the average group of learners generally. And your group of learners have their own unique learning differences, their own interests, needs, objectives, values, beliefs about learning English. And teachers can certainly benefit from using course books. They have a progressive syllabus, clear listening aims and objectives, and especially nowadays, lots of these activities have been well designed and they seem to work for a lot of learners. But it's very difficult to escape the fact that, our students have their own needs and interests. And especially adults, I think, but teenagers and perhaps even children, they want to have some input into what they're learning and how they're learning. And one way to meet the challenge of using a course book and responding to the actual needs of your learners is to take this, what we call a restricted, negotiated syllabus approach, which is where you discuss the approach, the syllabus, the curriculum, with your learners, and you make decisions collaboratively. And that enables them to have some responsibility for how the course books are used both inside the classroom and outside the classroom or between classes. So here are a few ideas, ways you can encourage your learners to take some control about how they use the course book. And in doing so, you'll be developing learner autonomy. Hopefully, this will result in them becoming more autonomous learners, self-directed learners, and really taking control of and responsibility for their own learning. Because there's only so much you can do inside the class. And learners who really progress are often able to take what they learn in the classroom and use it to their advantage outside of the class. And they use what they learn to improve their own English learning strategies. And that could be, for example, listening to podcasts, watching TV, reading books in English, going to language exchanges, using English outside the classroom in whatever way they want to, playing video games, however, but it gives them some sort of control over how they are actually learning. So first of all, you could try letting your learners choose their course books. Now, of course, this isn't an option in many language schools, but perhaps you could bring in a selection of course books at the beginning of the course and let them review them, assess them, evaluate them, share their opinions about what they think might be suitable for them and the ones which aren't quite so suitable. And then perhaps you could even come to a class decision about which one is best suited to meet their specific learning needs. Okay, so that really depends on also making sure that your learners are able to define their learning needs. And one way you can do this is to ask them, is to give them options, is to let them refer to the contents page of the coursebook and decide upon which, for example, units, which areas are relevant to their specific learning journeys and which ones can help them meet their own needs. But as I said, learners really, certainly adult learners and teenagers, are able to consider their own needs, what they might need to use English for in the future, what they need English for now. And if you get them thinking and reflecting upon this, I think they'll make a much better decision about how they can actually improve their own English in their own time and how they can use the coursebook more effectively to meet their own specific aims. So as I said, getting learners to actually define their own learning needs as an individual activity first. Maybe it could be a homework activity, and then you could ask them to share their ideas, share their opinions about their own needs in class and discuss them, first as pairs, then as small groups, and then as a whole class. And then I think that they'll learn from each other as well, and they'll also be able to really evaluate their own specific learning needs, because the learning needs they first come up with may not actually be that relevant to their own situation. They might think they need to learn something, and then even another student might say something which will cause them to reflect and think, actually, maybe it's not that important to really study grammar 2 hours a day. Maybe using gap fills. Maybe there is a different way I could do it. Maybe actually I've got to learn how to listen to English more effectively. I've got to expose myself to more spoken English. That will really help me, because the chances are I will need English in a job in which I'll be asked to speak and listen to English for a large proportion of my working day. So actually studying grammar exercises may not be quite as effective for me as doing lots of listening activities in class. So there we are. So get them to think about their learning needs and let them look at the selection of course books and see which course books might help them actually meet those specific needs. And again, with topics, you'll find a lot of course books have fairly generic topics. The home and the house, food and drink, education, work, clothing describing people, sports and hobbies, these sorts of things. Now, depending on your learners, some of these topics might be relevant or might not be that relevant to them. Especially with shorter courses, they might need specific to study English related to specific topics. So one simple activity is to get the students to rate the topics in order of importance. So that can give you an indication of how much time you need to spend on each topic. And it might be that you need to use the course book and complete the course book, but the topic of, let's say, food and drink might not be that suitable for your group of learners. So you could do it in a very short time and spend more time looking at another topic which might be of more use to them. For example, finding work. Now again, the contents page of every course book, now they have an enormous amount of information, and as well as the topics, they usually tell you about which grammar items need to be focused on. Now, depending on your learners, they may, for example, be very comfortable using past tenses, and yet you have 2 or 3 units in the course book dedicated to helping them improve their understanding and their ability to use past tenses. So again, if you know they don't need to spend that much time on this particular grammar area, maybe you could either skip it or just quickly review it and then move on to something which will benefit them a lot more. So using the grammar syllabus in a course book, and again, go to the contents page, and you can discuss with your students, or you can assess your students' ability to use these different grammar structures, and that will give you and them an idea of what they need to spend time on. Again, just doing a simple grammar diagnostic test at the beginning can give you a lot of information about what they need to focus on. Now, another way to use your course books and encourage learner autonomy is to let your learners choose which activities or exercises they can do for homework. So, for example, lots of reading texts or controlled practice activities like gap fills do not need to be done in class time. These can be done for homework. In fact, reading texts in particular, if your learners have fairly effective reading skills, they know how to skim, scan, read intensively and so on, well, you could ask them to do that for homework, think about the comprehension questions for homework, and then report back in the actual class. So that means you're not assigning class time to something like a 20-minute reading activity. And you might decide, and your learners may benefit from doing more productive work on their speaking and listening skills in the class. So this is kind of called flipping the classroom, and the idea is that you get students to do a lot of the work for homework. Even things like grammar presentations. Most grammar books now have very simple grammar explanations, and you could give these to your learners to do for homework, and then they could, in the next class, use that new grammar point in more engaging, practical speaking or writing activities, more communicative activities. So think about flipping the classroom and doing as much as you can at home, or encourage them to do this work at home and then bring in what they learn into the classroom and using it practically. So it's more skills development work. Now, another thing about course books is they are written often for an international audience, a global audience, and so a lot of them may not be that culturally relevant for the learners. I remember a few years ago coming across a text about the modern writer Joanna Trollope. I think she writes romance novels and she's British, and Anthony Trollope, who was an early 20th century literary writer. And most of my students weren't particularly interested in this particular topic. They didn't know either of the authors. They didn't seem to be the sort of books they would consider reading. And this reading text was basically designed to differentiate different past tenses. Now, it might be a lot easier and more effective for your learners to actually give them a similar sort of text, take the idea, but related to an author they're familiar with. So it could be maybe they're interested in reading Harry Potter books. So just adapt it. Take the idea from the course book, and maybe you could find a text about J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, talking about her life like a mini biography, and use that biography to present different past tenses to your learners. It will make it a lot more relevant, a lot more engaging, a lot more motivating for your learners. And again, in terms of learner autonomy, you could even get them to find their own resources, their own texts, whether it's written text, text for reading or even audios, and use them in the classroom. So you start encouraging your learners to bring materials into the class, ones which they've chosen, which are of interest to them. And you'll notice that that can make a real difference. It can get them a lot more interested in the classroom, in the classes. And again, in most course books you have speaking and writing activities for productive work, for activating the new language. And often they're just simple discussion questions or problem-solving tasks. And in my experience, you can get learners to design these similar tasks. If it's just a few questions, for example, using the past tenses, then you could get your learners to actually create the questions. Okay, or to adapt the questions so they're more relevant to their particular teaching context or learning context and their own needs and experiences. Your learners have spent years using course books, so they're very familiar with these kind of activities, and so they're quite good at creating their own activities. Now, another way to encourage learner autonomy and use the course books is to actually ask your learners to research the grammar topics or even the lexical topics or lexical areas in the class. So rather than presenting these items yourself, maybe that could be your homework. That could be the homework you assign to your learners. You could say, okay, I want you to do research on this particular grammar area, and then tomorrow I want you to present to the rest of the class. You could get them presenting to each other in small groups, collaborating with their students, creating slides for their presentations, recording audio or video presentations at home, which are then shared with the rest of the class. So again, it's all about you doing less work and them doing more work and taking responsibility for the learning. And learners, in my experience, are more than capable of doing that. They've watched you, their teacher, and other teachers give so many presentations, language-related presentations, that they're able to do so. I mean, it could almost be like a project that they have to, during the course, they have to basically research a particular language item and give a presentation on it at some point during the course. And they don't have to do this individually, they could do that in small groups as well. Now again, most course books have tests, progress tests. Now you can use them, or you could even ask your learners to create tests for their classmates. So again, you put learners in small groups and they know which topics they've studied or which language areas they've studied. So perhaps they could actually create their own tests, and then they could actually give these tests to the other groups in the class. So again, you might have to manage this and just supervise this to make sure, you know, that the tests are appropriate and correct. But again, I've done this with learners and they're more than capable of doing so, creating testing materials for each other. Okay, and it really gets them investing in their own learning. And we can take this approach of learners creating their own materials for the reading text as well. In most course books you have reading texts or listening texts with comprehension questions. Well, you could get the learners to write these comprehension questions and then share the questions with the other people in their group. They could do the reading at home, create a set of questions related to the reading, and then in the following class they can actually share their questions, and that's really one way of encouraging learner autonomy, getting them to take much more responsibility for what they're learning. And so what I'm saying here is that students are really familiar with course books, and so they know how they work. In fact, students may have spent 10, 15, 20, 30 years, who knows. Adult learners have spent years and years and years using course books, so they know how they work. And so actually, you can get them to use this knowledge to create and to adapt and to modify and to exploit these materials. And it works really well. And in my experience, students may need a bit of help at the beginning. They may not feel so confident creating that or developing or adapting the course book a little bit more, but they're able to do so. And you'll find over time they enjoy doing so, and it makes the course books much more relevant to what they really need. And as I said, it's a really great way of encouraging learner autonomy and getting the students to really reflect upon, assess and take control of their language learning. So I hope that helped. I hope that gave you a few ideas. And well, experiment. Start small. Start with small experiments. Maybe just you could ask students to create a couple of, if you give them a reading text with reading comprehension questions, maybe ask them to write a couple of extra questions for each activity, and over time they'll take more control and see where that goes. I think it's definitely an interesting approach to take, and I think your students will definitely benefit from it. So I hope that helped, and I'll speak to you in the next episode. If you want to subscribe to the blog, go to www.teachenglishspain.com, and I'll speak to you in the next episode. Hasta luego.